Hello tripodders, my name's Steve and welcome to my first ever Behind the Tripod YouTube video. And in today's video we will be looking at exposure. What is it, how do we do it, why is it important, and crucially why you need to learn about it. So let's start with the why. Why should you, as a beginner photographer, spend your precious time and energy learning about exposure when surely with all the technology available in your fancy new camera, you could just stick it in the auto mode, let the camera make all the decisions while you focus on taking nice photographs? It does sound like a reasonable idea, doesn't it? Well no, unfortunately it doesn't really work like that, and here's the thing. Your camera doesn't know what's in your head. It doesn't know what effect you're trying to achieve, and it's simply just not as clever as you are. So it'll do its best and have a go at exposing your image for you, but if you really want to take control of your camera and start taking those beautiful images that you've got in your mind, then you really need to start to grasp the fundamentals of exposure. You see, learning how to expose an image properly is really the key to unlocking the door to your creative potential as a photographer. But before we delve into the various aspects of exposure, I just want to quickly touch on something called stops. You see, stops are essentially a unit of measurement that describes the amount of light used to expose an image. You may have heard other photographers talking about stops of light when they talk about their own photography. But let's keep things simple for today's video. All you need to remember is that each stop is either a doubling or a halving of light that's used to make up the exposure for the image. I've popped a really useful infographic with all the main stops for each aspect of photography below in the description, so please download this and use it, particularly if you're new to photography. It's also worth bearing in mind that some cameras and lenses have half or third stops. They can give you even greater control over the exposure. But again, let's keep things simple for today. We're only going to work with the whole stops to either double or half the light. Okay, so back to exposure. Just remember that there are three aspects to exposure, and it can help to visualize these as three sides of a triangle. After all, we're photographers, aren't we? And we're generally visual thinkers. So we have apertures here on one side, we have shutter speeds here on the other side, and on the base we have something called ISO. Now let's break this down even further. A photograph is essentially a record of light on a sensor, and as the light travels from our subject, it first has to travel through the lens. Within the lens is a hole, and this is made up by several blades. This is called the aperture, and it works a bit like the pupil inside your eye. It widens to let more light in, and it narrows when it's a bright day to let less light in. In the lens, the width of the hole is measured in something called f-stops, and can you remember what we said about stops of light? Each f-stop doubles or halves the amount of light entering through the lens. You may have heard photographers talking about f numbers such as f2.8 or f11, and these numbers always refer to the lens aperture, with lower numbers being a wider aperture and a higher number referring to a smaller aperture. But apertures control more than just the light entering the camera. They also control something called depth of field. Look at these two images. The picture on the left has a shallow depth of field. Can you see how the photographer has blurred the background, something we call bokeh? And this has also then kept the person's face in sharp focus. Now compare this with the image on the right, where everything from the closest subject all the way to the back of the image is sharp and in focus. This is what's known as depth of field. You see, there's shallow depth of field with lots of creamy bokeh, and there's deep depth of field where everything's in focus, and there are a load of points in between. By changing the aperture, you can take full control of the depth of field and bokeh in your image. If you're starting to feel a bit confused, then please don't worry. It's perfectly normal at this stage, and I promise you that it will get easier. You see, understanding the exposure triangle is a bit like riding a bike. It's really difficult at first, it takes a lot of concentration, but once you've nailed it, you can just do it without thinking. Right, so let's add another layer and talk about the other side, shutter speeds. So as the light travels from your subject, it continues its journey through the lens and it's next faced with the shutter. Now you can think of the shutter as a pair of heavy blackout curtains that cover a large window on a really sunny day. When the curtains are closed, all that light outside is kept out of the room and you're standing in a completely dark area. Opening the curtains wide lets that light flood into the room, but then you close them again, which plunges the room back into darkness. Now the amount of time you keep the curtains open, flooding the room with light before closing them again is called the shutter speed. And shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second, such as 1/60th, 1/500th and even 1/1000th, and the shutter speed controls how long the curtain in your camera stays opening, allowing all that lovely light to hit your sensor. Now shutter speeds increase and decrease in stop increments, and can you remember what we talked about with stops and what they relate to? That's right, a halving or doubling of the light. But as the curtain stays open, letting all that lovely light into the camera, subjects can move within the frame. If the shutter's open long enough, this movement will be picked up as motion blur. Even us holding the camera can create motion blur. If we choose a long shutter speed, just the movement of our body can create camera shake, and you've probably seen that in pictures before when you've taken a photograph on your phone in a dark room. However, sometimes motion blur is what we actually want in our image, other times we don't. So let's look at a couple of examples. In the image on the left, the photographer has chosen a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion. However, the photographer on the picture on the right has gone for that slow shutter speed to really slow everything down, to slow down the water, and to give that image a magical, soft and ethereal quality. So far we've seen that apertures affect depth of field and shutter speeds affect motion blur. So the last part of the exposure triangle is the base, that's called the ISO. Now ISO is simply a measure of the sensitivity to light of the camera sensor. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive to light your sensor is and the lighter your picture will be. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitive your sensor is and the darker your picture will be. We can use the ISO settings to adjust our exposure to make a lighter or darker photo. However, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The higher we push the ISO, the more digital noise we create, and I'm sure you've all seen noise before. It's that sort of grainy, gravelly look that looks a bit like light sandpaper, and it can creep into some of your images, particularly if they're shot at high ISO. Now, modern cameras can go quite high with their ISO settings without introducing very much digital noise, and some noise can always be edited out. However, you will eventually reach a tipping point where there's just too much noise to edit out and it just wrecks the picture. So the best way of testing your camera's ISO capability is to play around with the ISO settings in different light conditions. This should really help you to grasp how your sensor reacts to pushing the ISO and how far you can push it in different light. So I know what you may now be thinking, how can I possibly use all this when taking an image? There's just an awful lot to think about. Well, let's quickly look at a few practical examples of how you can use the exposure triangle when setting up your shots. You see, I'm a firm believer that understanding the exposure triangle opens up a host of creative possibilities and will really help you to take control of your photography and to take it to the next level. You'll be able to accurately predict how your image will look, and you'll be able to take the kinds of photos that you just can't do on a phone. So let's think about it. If you want your background soft, then open up the aperture. If you want silky smooth water, then you need to slow down the shutter speed. And if your image is grainy and a bit noisy, then your ISO might be a bit high, so drop that down. But remember, any changes you make will affect the overall exposure, so to maintain your exposure, you'll need to change one or two sides of the triangle. So let's look at some more examples. You've got a perfectly exposed image at f8, 1/125th of a second and ISO 800, but you decide that you want to blur the background. So we open up the aperture by one stop to f5.6. This now means that your image is overexposed by one stop. So to maintain that correct exposure, you now have a couple of choices. Firstly, you could increase the shutter by one stop to 1/250th of a second, or instead you could reduce the ISO by one stop to ISO 400. Okay, so let's look at another example. It's the same starting exposure, only this time you decide that you want to speed up the shutter speed to freeze the movement of your children playing in the garden. So you increase the shutter speed by 3 stops to 1/1000th of a second. So you've successfully frozen your children's movements playing in the garden, but your image is now 3 stops underexposed. But that's okay, because you now understand the exposure triangle, and this time you have 3 choices. You could open up the aperture by 3 stops to f2.8. The image is now technically correctly exposed, but it may make focusing on your children quite difficult, as you now have a very shallow depth of field to play around with. So instead, you could increase the ISO by 3 stops to ISO 6400, but unfortunately this has made your image very noisy and it's kind of unusable. So your third choice is to use a mixture of the two. You could increase your ISO by 1 stop to ISO 1600, which controls the grain, and then you could widen the aperture by 2 stops to f4, which will control the depth of field. If you're confused, don't worry, you're in good company. Everybody finds this hard at the beginning, but it is definitely worth persevering with. All of the options in the last example will give you exactly the same exposure, but you can see that the overall effect on the image will be vastly different. So a bit of a fly through. In my opinion, the best way to learn the exposure triangle is to get out with your camera and practice and practice and practice. Play with your camera, mess around with the exposure settings and see how this affects your image. Well, I hope you agree that taking the time to learn how to expose your image properly and thinking about exposure in terms of a triangle can unlock your creative potential as a photographer. Remember that anything worthwhile is always difficult to learn in the beginning, but to make it easier for you to learn, you could download the chart in the description below, so while you're learning to expose, you can use it as a handy reference to keep you on track. And thanks for watching. This is a brand new channel. This is my first ever video, so please like, subscribe, all that malarkey. It really will help to grow my channel and ultimately allow me to create more of these videos to help you with your photography. And before we go, please also consider joining our friendly and supportive Facebook community. I've dropped a link below. I think that's everything. So until next time, tripodders, keep snapping and I'll see you soon.